Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this session this afternoon. I'm really excited to have with me Michel Roth and Tom Hickling from Microsoft. And over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk everything WVD. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Afternoon.
How are we?
All good, thanks. Yeah, and yourself?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Michel, can we just do some introductions? Let's start with you. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, my name is Michel Roth, and I'm a what they call a Windows Virtual Desktop Global Black Belt, which is the Microsoft way of saying that we specialize in one particular Microsoft service, which in our case is Windows Virtual Desktop. I work in a team for EMEA together with Tom and some other folks, and my area of focus is more on the business side of things, so more the business cases, customer success, and things like that.
Excellent, thank you. And Tom?
Yeah, so Tom Hickling. I am also a Windows Virtual Desktop Global Black Belt in EMEA. So exactly the same team and virtually exactly the same role as Michel, except for I'm more technically focused rather than sort of the commercial business side of it all.
Okay, great. Well, I've certainly had the privilege of working with both of you probably for many, many years. I dread to think how long our friendships and relationships go back, but thank you for being part of this session. Michel, the topic and the theme of today is all about transformation, unite, bringing people together. We've heard stories from customers and also Microsoft, Citrix already about what they're doing in the EUC space. Have you got any stories you can share around how WVD has been helping transform businesses, particularly over the last 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, you can probably imagine, the last year has been a very interesting ride. So for those that have been around a little bit longer, looking at WVD, we GA'd, so the version of WVD that's production ready. So the GA version is now, I think, let me look at the calendar, say like 16 months old or something like that. So it's not really old for a Microsoft product. Oftentimes they are around for longer, but we've seen the tremendous adoption. It's one of the fastest growing Azure services that Microsoft has. And of course, unfortunately, I should say it's due to COVID for a large part. We had a very healthy growth before COVID hit, but when COVID hit, it just accelerated tremendously. And it's something actually that, the silver lining is that in this really sad space and time that we are in now, we were able to help many customers. So if we look at some of the customer success stories that we have internally, we see that quite a few of them are what we call COVID related, or it's where we helped customers. I call it deliver remote productivity. So in many cases, that's remote working. For example, I won't name any customers specifically, but there's one of the largest banks in the world, which has, like many other banks, they have a lot of developers, right? So they're using WVD to make 10,000 remote workspaces available. And parts sometimes that's because they have to do something overnight. Sometimes it's a part of an existing strategy that they have that they now have to accelerate. But the underlying idea is the same, that with WVD you can achieve things that you could never do before, and it allows you to solve unique business problems that you also couldn't solve before. Another great example is actually from your neck of the woods, where we've been trying to help universities in the United Kingdom. And we're working, I think, up to closely to like 40 universities, and they had this tremendous struggle where, it was, I think COVID started like in March and April to really impact the mainland of Europe. But but they had to still facilitate learning whilst the campuses were closed. So that was one very big problem that they have, and they didn't have weeks or months or years to do it. I think maybe many people listening to this, they've been around in the virtual desktop industry for a while. And we all know that if you are doing a project around EUC and virtual desktops, that if it's thousands of users, you're talking several months, right? At least from start to finish. But people simply didn't have this time. And WVD was able to help there. Because as you know, it doesn't really matter what endpoint you have. So you can have a very lightweight endpoint that's very secure. But most importantly, you can deploy it in days or weeks versus several months. And that's exactly the speed that they needed. And the other side of it is that these are super uncertain times, right? So nobody really knows what's going to happen next and when it's going to happen. So they don't know, in this case, how long they will need remote learning for how many people they need it for. And that's also where WVD is perfect, because it's a pure OpEx model, right? So everybody needs to make a plan right now based on the information that they have. And with WVD, there's no big investment required, because you only pay for it when you use it. So if you need more, then you can pay for more. And if you need less, then you pay less, right? And if you want to stop using it tomorrow, then your investment isn't gone. It's not like you have to buy a server rack, which, by the way, was impossible in COVID times. We've talked to customers that simply went to WVD because when they tried to order new servers, it would take 7 months because it wasn't coming from China, then all this other stuff. So there's all these things that we learned that were impossible before. And the case I also want to highlight for the universities is that we learned not only was it very difficult to invest big money just because they didn't have the budget, and because of this other issue that you couldn't even get on-premises hardware even if you wanted to. The other part, they have yearly budgets, right? And you can imagine that if they are having a hard time predicting how many students will need access and when and for how long, the same thing applies for this government above that, right? So how much budget do we give, or do we have available to give to the universities? So I think that was a great example, and there's many like that, to be honest. It's not really one industry. Everybody had to cope with remote working and remote learning. So I guess that's one big thing that we helped our customers with. Another separate one, which is kind of COVID unrelated in a way, a theme that we see simply is cost savings. And I say it's unrelated to COVID, kind of, because cost savings is always a thing, right? So we had that as a business driver for WVD before COVID happened, and now there's already customers that know, for example, in let's say in the aviation industry, right? I think you can think of all kinds of industries that know that there's a very tough time coming, and costs is the only thing that they can do, because increasing their business is not something they can control, right? If you can't fly, then it's very hard to increase your business if you're in aviation. So because of the unique characteristics of WVD, with Windows 10 multi-session, with the fact that you don't pay for the Windows license, with the fact that you don't pay for an RDCal, and this complete move to just consumption-based computing, we see a lot of customers using WVD. Some examples, there's like a very large retail chain in Sweden, with probably clothing brands that they've taken their complete on-premises estate, which was one of the largest virtual desktop estates in that country, and moved it to Azure, just because the business case was a no-brainer for them, right? This is a long-term investment for them, and this goes across the industries. There's Germany's a manufacturing country. That's also where we have customers looking at WVD, where they expect their business. So this is their business case is 75% savings compared to what they used to do on-prem.
Yeah.
Which, everybody does on-prem differently. Some people are, rocket scientists at it. Some people, didn't have the time or the money, but a 75% saving is a lot. Energy company in France, expecting to save 3 to 5 times. Other companies are just using this, the learnings from WVD and COVID to. This customer is manufacturing in Turkey, and they are changing completely the way they work. Right, so they're closing down offices. They used to have offices in all these different cities, and they're closing it and giving people a home office permanently and having them work from there. And so the commissioning process for them, it's also important to be adopted to the market very quickly, has accelerated by 90%.
Wow.
So if you look at those things. And then I have 2 smaller categories, which I think is important to explain how people are using WVD. And one interesting, I call the category, I call it cloud bursting or cloud DR. So there's one aspect of the business where some customers, they have this very seasonal workload, right? So maybe it's a bad example today, but usually in the hotel business, during the summer in Northern Europe, it's very busy, right? It's sometimes 3 times as busy or 4 times or 5 times as it is in winter.
Yeah.
And if you're using a virtual, infrastructure, then on-prem, you're half of the year you're paying for something that you're not using, 80% of that. So they love using that to just temporarily use WVD to provide additional, workspaces, if you like. The other one, that's it's actually a bit sad, but it's the reality of today, is that we've had quite a few customers, which of course I won't name, but that were compromised, right? They were hacked. And at that moment in time, they have to do something, right? Because the way that these hacks happen, it means that, they're completely down, right? There's nothing they can do. And as you can probably imagine, if it's a really bad hack, then it will take weeks and years and months to fix it, even if you can. So what some of these customers do is they have to create a completely new remote workspace from scratch. They're losing millions, right? So the speed to get this up and running is very important. And there's one example of a customer that had 7,000 VMs deployed for their employees in 4 days.
Yeah.
Just so they can continue to work, right? And in fact, they liked it so much that they never went back, right? But that's a different story. But those things are just, because some people say, WVD is just, it's another way of doing VDI, but there's some unique characteristics to it that allow you to do things that you could never do before, even today, right? If you were to start a completely new on-prem environment, I double dare you to go from nothing to 7,000 users in 4 days.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you think about transformation there. You've mentioned transformation about how, from a budget point of view and a cost point of view, WVD has changed things quite considerably for organizations. Yeah. You've also mentioned how it's changing how people work. Obviously, as we've moved to work from home, or we're shutting down offices, etc. But the other one that there is transformation of how it's deployed. All 3 of us have been around the block in the EUC space for quite a long time. And I can remember the first Citrix farm that I ever set up. I dread to think how long it took me and how big the book was that I had to read and how many registry settings I needed to change and all that sort of stuff. I mean, Tom, it's just completely simplified now in terms of how you onboard new users to such a platform.
It is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the key differentiator here is the fact that this is all running on a hyperscale cloud. That fundamentally changes it. So when Michel says, and I often talk about this with customers, is that WVD is not just a new version of what, RDS. It's a major evolution, fundamentally different. Same end use case, same capability, but we're now delivering it from a cloud platform, and the cloud has fundamentally changed computing all up. So the ability to deploy infrastructure via code in an instant and have that provisioned into any one of 64 Azure regions globally in minutes is a fundamental change. And as Michel said, the ability to say, well, I'm going to start tomorrow and I haven't paid anything. So I haven't gone and submitted an order to some hardware vendor and 6 months later some infrastructure rocks up, which you've got a rack and stack. You just deploy your code, and in the time it takes, which could be minutes, could be half an hour, whatever it might be, you've got infrastructure that you can then deploy to your users so that they can then be productive. That is a fundamental change that the cloud has brought to this workload.
Yeah. A quick question for both of you. But, we talk a lot about how this market was growing already. It's then been fueled by COVID and obviously the need to work from home. I mean, what are your thoughts if and when we do return to a level of normality? I mean, I think there's different views on whether that's going to happen or not. But I personally don't see all of a sudden the decline in us going back to deploying workspaces in the way that we did. This isn't just something that is for work from home, is it?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're spot on there. Much like you said, I've deployed Citrix 20 years ago, kind of thing, and I've done it for lots of companies, and as a consultant possibly, or also internally within some large organizations. And this use case has predominantly been around connecting users to a data center where you've located your VMs for security reasons, i.e. there's no footprint left on local devices. Now, Citrix and VMware and Microsoft, these capabilities have always had a remote working capability, but IT, organizations haven't really deployed this for that use case. So it's always been for, execs or IT who want to do remote support, or for those very small number of people whose job entailed them being remote permanently. But for everyone else who went to the office, it was you went to the office because that's where you did work. I think what we've now realized, well, in fact, organizations have realized, is that this technology has proven beyond any doubt that you can actually work from anywhere. The technology exists. The underlying platform exists that can scale to meet that demand, such that, why should an organization have expensive offices in the capitals, London and Paris and all these places, which are a huge expense? Why not half the size of those and have people work from wherever? So if they want to work in the office, then, they can. I think this is also an opportunity for organizations to sort of reevaluate what an office actually means. Is it lots of desks where people come in to do work? Or is it somewhere that teams come to collaborate for, a day a week or whatever it might be, and then go off to wherever they might need to be to do the same work? There's no requirement for people to work in a set office. Obviously there's the benefit of seeing people face to face. That's one of the things I think people have struggled with during, this pandemic. And, we're social creatures, so we do like to be back together. But, I think, like I said, we've proven this capability. There will be massive cost savings and, productivity improvements by not having to travel, particularly when you don't need to do it.
Yeah, agreed.
We've also spoken to customers, right? And I think there's actually a lot of research already that backs it up, is that and this particular research was in the Netherlands, which is, a pretty mature virtual desktop market, I should say. But I think there was 80% of the people that they interviewed, so these are the users, that said that after COVID, they would also want to work at least 2 days from home, where before it was 0. And I think that the other thing that they said was of the largest companies in the Netherlands, I think 70% said that they would never go back to the normal way of working. Meaning that you'd have to come into the office every day. So I think it's a given, right? It will not go back. I think it depends on how far it goes back.
Yeah.
It will mean some people are left. Some companies they won't make it, right?
Yeah.
That's a different.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting, the customers that I'm speaking to that do want to go back and do see, I mean, I've got customers that we've interviewed as part of Disrupt who have already gone back, in fact, and haven't been able to work from home. They're even changing how their strategy on how the workspace is delivered moving forward. Because even if you do go back to the office, and let's say that one of the big banks decide that they're going to send 10,000 people back into Canary Wharf, I think even they are reconsidering their use of virtual desktop infrastructure, desktop as a service, WVD, for instance, because you need that flexibility and you need that ability to give employees and people choice and the flexibility to work from home and from the office. And so I don't see it as two separate things anymore. I mean, they're even talking to me, you know, when they go back into the office, they'll still regard the devices as dirty devices. They'll regard the network in the corporate office as a dirty network, and they'll still authenticate and log in and access their workspace in the same way they do at home as if they do in the office. And for me, I think that just means that you're not going to suddenly see a massive drop off of people that are using WVD and virtual desktops. I think it's actually going to continue on. Yeah. Quick, Tom, let's talk about some of the technology. Obviously, 16, 18 months old, constantly maturing, constantly innovating. What are some of the most recent updates and what else is coming out shortly?
Yeah, sure. So I was looking at this, there's a massive amount and there's too much to talk about. But I'll just mention a few things, looking back maybe 6 months, and then also looking at the roadmap in two phases. Things that are in preview today, which customers can go and sign up for, and previews that will be starting shortly for new roadmap items. But let's just start by looking back. The first thing is WVD gateways. So these are Azure geographies that host the WVD gateway component, which is the service that connects users from wherever they are on the globe through to their virtual machine in Azure in whichever region they placed it. So obviously, the more of those there are, and the more that are closer to you as a user, the better, because that will reduce latency. Okay. So we've had, I don't know, 20 odd of these. And then back in September, we released new ones in Germany and South Africa. And then in October, we rolled them out to Switzerland and Canada. So those geographies have better connectivity. One of the most asked for, probably the second most asked for capability is support for Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or MEM. Mm-hmm. Now, there's actually a large piece of work, and we'll come on to that at the end when we talk about the preview features. But back in September, we announced support for hybrid Azure Active Directory domain join for Windows 10 Enterprise. So this is a single session version. So customers can use MEM as a single pane of glass for the management of a part of WVD, i.e. the single session. Yeah. There's been just a never-ending list of updates that have gone into the Azure portal specifically. Too many to mention. Some that might be worth mentioning is we've just eased the whole user experience in terms of deployment and sped that process up. One of the capabilities is that we now surface up the local account that gets created on the VMs should there any be a failure joining it to the domain. Now, a small capability, but we didn't actually articulate that to customers, so they weren't aware of actually what was happening. So now they get the capability of saying, this is the account I want created, rather than us taking what was their domain join account and creating a local account based on that. We've also enabled far more information to be surfaced up in the portal back to customers. So one of the things, we display the version of the WVD agent in the portal for their session hosts. We have enabled bulk operations, so you can bulk delete, bulk change the drain mode on these session hosts rather than doing it individually. And one of the features that got a lot of feedback, surprisingly, was the support for dark mode in the portal. And there was a small bug that wasn't displaying the text correctly. So you changed the dark mode and the text was still dark, so you couldn't really see it. That got a whole load of feedback. So it's interesting what customers think or feel is important and the response that we put into that. Those updates will continue going forward. Back in November, we updated support for PowerShell. So there's now version 2 of the WVD commandlets that supports or will bring support for MSIX app attach, which is a preview feature we'll mention in a minute. Obviously, most people are aware we acquired FS Logics. It'll be close to Michel's heart. That product continues to get updates. So there was a major September update, and then in January there was a hot fix for that set of updates. So point here is FS Logics as a product is still getting massive updates as we go forward.
Good.
One of the other features was RBAC, so role-based access control. If you go to the Azure portal, you've effectively got access to an entire data center. If you're doing this on premises, obviously IT doesn't give everybody access to the entire data center and everything within it. RBAC is the mechanism for providing specific sets of permissions to different teams. We support that in WVD, but have added a whole set of additional capabilities so that you can distribute the permissions inside of a WVD deployment. So different people can do different things.
Makes sense.
It's not just technology. We've also last month introduced a 30% discount for 2 types of VMs that are deployed inside of WVD. That has to be enabled before the end of March. So it's just about assisting companies out there to adopt, I suppose, quicker.
Interesting.
So those are just some of the preview features that were released over the last few months, going back to November, starting with a product we called RDP Short Path Private. Now, what this does is it brings 2 things. It's effectively the utilization of a managed network, which is either express route, private dedicated connection into Azure, or a VPN from a customer's location into their Azure subscription. Now, what this means is that the RDP traffic connecting through to the VMs is now off of the internet, and it also means it bypasses our control plane. And what that means is that there's reduced number of network hops that are required to get to the session hosts.
Awesome.
It also introduces the UDP protocol, and perhaps more specifically, a new protocol called URCP that Microsoft Research Labs created some time back, obviously based upon UDP. Now, this is obviously a much more efficient protocol than TCP. Now, the net result is the combination of those 2 things produces much improved user experience by virtue of reduced latency to those virtual machines. So that should be going GA in the coming months. And then December was a bumper month for preview features. So one of those was a thing called Azure Monitor for WVD, also known as Insights inside of the portal. Now, this is a Microsoft pre-built Azure Monitor workbook that displays what we think are the top metrics that a typical WVD admin would want surfaced up to them.
Okay.
And it's fully automated. So you would just basically go and click a button, and we will go and configure all of the diagnostic settings for the WVD objects and push out the monitoring agent to the session hosts, and then automate the collection of the metrics for those VMs, event logs. And then we also will automatically present the visualizations of that data back into some nice sort of graphs. So it's a nice feature. You don't really have to do anything bar enabling it and pushing out this config via a single button, but you can then modify it yourself. So if you wanted to stop collecting certain metrics and add additional ones, or present the data in a different way, you can absolutely do that inside of Azure Monitor.
Perfect.
One of the other features that got a lot of interest and continues to is this thing called MSIX App Attach. We refer to it as the future of dynamic application delivery. Now, this is actually the combination of 2 things coming together. So MSIX, unrelated to WVD, predates WVD, is our new application packaging format that will eventually, over time, effectively replace everything that goes before it, such as MSI, AppV, and all those others. Now, it's not a like-for-like replacement, in particular for AppV, but it will, like I said, over time, replace that capability. So that's MSIX. The app attach is a WVD specific component, only available in WVD, and it's the attaching of MSIX applications that are stored effectively on a VHD or a SIMFS file, and those get attached or mounted onto the session host. And then the applications within those VHDs are then registered with the operating system when the user signs in, enabling them to just go and launch an app as if it was installed locally, even when obviously it isn't. Now, the benefit here is that an organization can have a single golden image and then distribute that and treat those VMs like sort of cattle class. We don't really care too much about them because they're not specific. They're not siloed for a set of users or a set of applications. They're effectively identical. If there's a problem with one, basically you just replace it, and you bring in these applications dynamically to the users at the point that they need it. So it's kind of a game changer, we think, or it will be in the future, for how you deliver applications, which is effectively what we're all here to do. WVD, Citrix, VMware, it's all been about how to get users productive with the applications that they need. And in the past, it's been difficult to do that, and you've ended up with hundreds of silos for various reasons. That now we have the opportunity now of moving away from that model and dynamically delivering these applications.
Yeah. So just to be clear on that, unlike AppV, the applications are not virtualized and self-contained.
They're not virtualized. They are self-contained. So they effectively run in a container, not to be confused with Kubernetes and all that kind of stuff, but an application container, an MSIX container.
Can they talk to each other?
They can, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then does each application have its own layer, if I can use that, or can you put multiple applications into a layer that you then attach?
You can, yes. So they can contain one application if that's what you want to do, or they can contain multiple. So there's a process that's called expansion. So you take this application that's in a MSIX format and expand it into a VHD or a SIMFS. Now, if you do that multiple times with different applications, they will exist in the same VHD if that's the format that you're using. And then when you go and publish that to users inside of the Azure portal, our process will understand that there's multiple apps in there and allow you to publish one or all of them if you want to different users.
Perfect. Okay. Great stuff. All right.
So there were a few more.
Well, go on.
If we got time.
We like more.
It's a never-ending list, but I've shortened it somewhat. Another capability is screen capture protection. Now, this is ideal for those organizations that work in sort of high compliancy industries where you have to be able to prevent end users from taking screen grabs effectively or accidentally sharing information, or for that matter, a malicious end user or hacker, whatever, being able to grab content from a screen sharing session. So what we have enabled in this preview is that if a user fires up the snipping tool or any other snipping tool, or they're sharing a session through Zoom, for example, or Teams, or whatever it might be, the WVD session, the window will either go black or it'll actually completely disappear. So you take a screen print and you'll just get a black blob. So it prevents the capability of anybody either maliciously doing that or accidentally sharing their session if they're sharing their screen inside of Teams with another organization. So talking actually about Zoom is a good segue. It's not just Microsoft that have been enabling new capabilities around this capabilities. So Zoom, if we go back a step, actually, you're probably aware that Microsoft have enabled Teams media optimization. So this is the ability to redirect Teams calls down to the local devices who establish the voice and video call, and then it's presented back up into the session. So Zoom have done effectively exactly the same thing for their client. So Zoom will now work in an optimized manner inside of a WVD. In fact, in the VDI type use case, all up. End computing, now they also made an announcement around their devices supporting WVD natively. And I think that you guys over at IGEL have a close sort of relationship and collaboration with them. And I think their devices support IGEL OS as well. So lots of sort of collaboration going on there. There are a few sort of what's coming and upcoming previews. So everything I've mentioned there will be going GA over the coming months. But there's some new features and previews that will be starting soon. Going back to the gateways, if you live in the United Arab Emirates, they will be getting some gateways in the near future. Another thing that's particularly relevant to European customers, and for that matter, UK customers, is our metadata service. Now, this is where we store the information that defines your configuration. So if you go and deploy WVD, there's some information about these VMs are in this host pool, for example. That's all stored in some databases that currently are located in a number of Azure regions in the US. Now, that has been a problem for some, particularly European customers, who stipulate that it has to be in the EU, or it just can't be in the US. So what we've announced is that the EU, specifically North Europe and West Europe, will get this metadata service in March. So customers will then be, when they go and deploy WVD, they'll see these options to say West Europe, and they can go and deploy the metadata in there. The UK, Australia, and Canada will be coming in June. Another service is this thing we call Start VM on Connect. Now, what this does is it enables the end user to have the power to power on their VM just at the right time that they need it. Okay, so without this, IT has to predict when they think the user will start, and then it might start the VM 30 minutes beforehand. But that's 30 minutes of cost of that VM running that they have to pay for, and it's not in use. What happens if that user is having a half day or is not in that day? That's more time that VM's powered on. The reverse is also true. If they start early and the VM's not powered on, then they're going to be unproductive. So the client, the WVD client, will now power on a deallocated Azure VM when they click on the icon. So the icon will just display that the VM is starting, and then we'll connect them to it once it's powered on. So maximize the cost savings by having these VMs powered off for as much of the time as possible. We mentioned Teams optimizations. That's coming for Mac OS. So there's lots of organizations out there that do have a MacBook deployment, and those users want to maybe also use WVD and also want to use Teams inside of that WVD session. So we would just say to Mac users out there, keep their eyes on App Central for a new updated Mac OS client, hopefully in the next couple of months, that will support those media optimizations. And then the final two previews that will be starting soon are the top two things that are asked for from our customers. The second most is going back to the MEM conversations, the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. We will be shortly starting a preview for the support of Windows 10 multi-session, which is really the hero capability inside of WVD. To have that supported inside of the Microsoft Endpoint Manager console. So a single pane of glass for the management of both physical devices, all of the other OSs that are supported, but now also Windows 10 multi-session. So you could do all your end-to-end administration policies and all of that kind of stuff. There will also be a new, very easy policy authoring capability that will enable you to just go and filter on, for example, Windows 10 multi-session and find policies that are only relevant to Windows 10, and then have the ability to publish that policy to WVD session hosts, which are importantly based upon their Azure AD group membership. And that takes us to the final one, which is the number one thing that customers ask for, which is Azure Active Directory domain join for WVD session hosts, in particular Windows 10 multi-session. That's also known simply as Azure AD only. So what this will do is provide the capability of having the Windows 10 multi-session VM only joined to Azure Active Directory. What that will enable, it will enable optionally, is that customers do not need to have Active Directory available at all for their WVD deployment. It's optional because there will be customers that still require AD, but if you didn't need or didn't require AD, then you can get rid of that infrastructure. So what this will provide then is true modern authentication to Azure AD, and also single sign-on to the session hosts themselves. So one account to get you into the session, as well as into Office apps, as well as into any other SaaS-based app which is secured behind Azure AD. It will also, at a much later date, introduce things like Azure AD B2B, which is the capability of one organization inviting other users into their directory to then present them services that the first organization operates WVD will become one of those. Now that will become much, much later in this roadmap. And these capabilities themselves actually are arriving in a number of phases over the next sort of 1 to 2 years. So this capability will start appearing, not all in one chunk, but appearing over time. So hopefully that will address the vast majority of our user sort of requests in this space.
Perfect. Tom, absolutely fantastic. Extremely, lots and lots of going on there.
Yes.
You know, obviously a big focus on collaboration, things like Teams and Zoom, very important. Obviously, you know, lots of conversations I'm having at the moment are all around, you know, is modern management a alternative solution to desktop as a service? And I think what's starting to happen is that we're starting to see that actually these two things need to coexist almost. And then probably quite a nice link to where we want to finish up today, you know, coming back to Michel, is, you know, lots going on around just how you can continue to reduce the cost, right? The ability to automatically start a VM. Michel, let's come back to you, because I know you wanted to sort of finish up today on how you've seen the overall cost of WVD is actually starting to fall.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Tom already mentioned it as in part of the roadmap. You'll hear he talked about app attach, which is, you know, from a business perspective, it's a way to lower the cost of management of your WVD platform, and those are, you know, great things. What we sometimes see with customers is that those are soft costs, so customers have a harder time using this in their business case, although they should. But I think one of the other interesting things that are not very well known, but our most successful customers, they do know it, is that in the beginning I focused on unique benefits that our customers utilize of WVD in order to lower costs. But that's mostly like in the beginning. So they have a status where they are today. It's usually on-prem, and then they make a business case to go to WVD. That's one very important step. And if, you know, WVD has unique characteristics to make that business case work. But, you know, the real power is to adopt a mindset of continuous optimization. And the great thing about WVD is that there's actually some very good examples of this continuous optimization benefiting the customer from the business side, which effectively means that when you use WVD, if you adopt this mindset of continuous optimization, the cost will go down, right? So the longer you use WVD, the cheaper it gets, and in many cases, the performance gets better too. And if you compare that to what people used to do, or many people still are doing, is building on-premises environment and renewing it every 3 to 5 years, that's the game changer. Because, you know, in itself, I think that if you were to build a new virtual desktop deployment today, it's almost impossible to do it cheaper on-prem. But that's only from the initial acquisition, you know, cost. But when you build something on-prem, you set it and forget it, and there's no way to optimize. Even if you were to be able to do something special that requires you, or that gives you the ability to have, you know, 5% or 10% more users on the same virtual machine, it doesn't matter because you've already paid for the asset, right? There's no monetary gain in it for you. Whereas with WVD, there is, because you only pay for what you use. So if you have optimizations, or if you have new capabilities that give you higher density or some other types of cost savings, it immediately impacts your bottom line. And just to make that a little bit more tangible, is you know, there are some examples that, and this is, you know, most of it, interestingly enough, isn't per se a WVD thing. So it's not a WVD feature that we release that suddenly reduces costs. Sometimes it happens, but the examples I have here are because of Azure, because of the cloud. So, for example, what's happened already a few times is that a new VM type would become available. So when WVD launched, you had, for example, the D series and the V3 version of that. And then, you know, a few months ago, we released the V4 version, which sounds like a small thing. but the V4 version is a little bit faster than the predecessor, but it's also a little bit cheaper. So we're not talking 20%, but maybe 5% or something like that. But the point is that you can use that benefit, right? You can change your VM types in a second, and then you can do it that way. Or maybe there's a completely new VM type with a GPU, for example, that gives you higher density. You can use it, right, and lower your cost. Or we've had customers change the local storage option in their virtual machine. Technically speaking, this is something called an ephemeral disk. And that's a special disk type in Azure that doesn't fit a whole lot of scenarios, but for WVD, it's a very interesting fit. And it completely takes the cost of local storage away. There are examples where Microsoft introduces price cuts for storage. So if you followed Azure file storage, the performance has gone up by increased IOPS and multi-channel, but the cost has gone down. We've reduced cost by 33%. So that is what, like from minute one, that's the cost reduction, right? And these are just some examples of what happened, I think, in the last 6 months. So my point is that if you adopt this mindset of continuous optimization, so don't do what you did on-prem, build it and never look back. That would be selling yourself short. But if you adopt this mindset, then there will be additional cost savings, optimizations, and possibilities. I don't know which ones, but there will be ones. And I think it's super important to remember that that's unique to WVD because it's a cloud service. So it's not a great solution to start with, but it's better over time. And I think that's something that's key to know about.
No, good. Thank you, Michel. I think it is quite easy, particularly for those of us that have been in this space for some time. It's quite easy for us to try and compare apples with apples all the time and look at the initial outlay and the capex cost. And to your point, Tom's gone through some features which quite obviously can help reduce the cost of how much Azure that you're actually using. But to your point, there's a whole other part of Microsoft that is constantly tweaking and changing the cost of those. And by the sounds of things, those costs continue to not just come down, but also features and functionality tends to improve. Guys, that was a completely awesome session, very comprehensive, a massive amount of detail. Great to hear customer stories around transformation. Great to hear such a comprehensive roadmap, and great to hear that you guys and the WVD business is still going well. And most importantly, providing solutions for organisations that are undoubtedly particularly keeping them afloat at this time. So, thank you very much for all of your time this morning. Or thank you very much for your time this afternoon, I should say. And I hope that I can come and see you very, very soon. Thanks again.
No problem. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Simon. Bye-bye.
Cheers.